Hello. As you saw in our last assignment, light has a huge impact on how we perceive color. In this video, I want to review how light interacts with objects and how color is affected by that. To begin, we use light and dark in two-dimensional work to show volume and structure because it is a near universal language. This is because as light leaves its source, it acts in a pretty predictable way that we've all experienced. So let's look at how light interacts with objects. So right out of camera, I have a clamp light. That clamp light is a spotlight that is producing a pretty warm light. And as that light leaves that source, it moves through the atmosphere, hitting everything in its path. As the form turns away from that light, that form turns into darkness. As that light moves through the atmosphere, it gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. So I like to call the way light becomes dimmer and dimmer as it moves through the atmosphere, hierarchy of light. So as light leaves its source and hits this sphere, the part that is facing the light is receiving the brightest light. We call that the highlight. Now as that form turns, in this case, because it's a sphere, it turns in every direction and it makes a smooth, gradual shift as opposed to an abrupt planar change. It gets a slight gradation, but at some point it fully turns from the light. This moment right here is called the shadow core. This shadow core is the darkest part of darkest value on the actual object. Now, as you notice, and you can kind of look, there is a moment where we go from highlight and a slight gradation to shadow core. But as you look at this, I want you to notice how the darkest part of the shadow core is closest to the light. So we get highlight, shadow core. That edge of the shadow core is darker here. So it makes a slight gradation, then jumps in value. Now the form continues to turn, and this form is not in a vacuum. It is in a world with other surfaces that are bouncing light back. So as the form continues to turn, we get what's called the reflective light. And this would be that reflective light right here. Now, reflective light is a vital element to include in your work. Very often we see the highlight, we see the shadow core, it's really clear. The reflective light is how the viewer and yourself as you move around the world judge how that objects are in proximity to each other. In other words, the way an object looks like it's not just floating in outer space or in a vacuum is by the fact that there's the presence of reflective light. So we have highlight, shadow core, reflective light, and then we have our cast shadow. I'm going to take this off here so we can see our cast shadow a little clearer. All right, let's look at our cast shadow. The cast shadow has a direct shape in relationship to the light. So the closer it is, the more direct it's under the light, the closer the shadow is to the object. The further it gets from the light, the more oblique that angle gets, and so the larger the shadow gets. Let's bring it back here to the middle so we can see it. Now the cast shadow is made by the absence of light, or the fact that the object is blocking the light. Right close to the object, the cast shadow's edge is strongest because it's really getting a lot of fall off. As that shadow gets further and further away from the object, it gets more kind of interference and reflective light, and that edge becomes blurrier. So this edge, this from here to here, is not a universal sharpness. It goes from being a harder edge to a blurrier edge. Now, how sharp and how blurry this is affected by the strength of the light. The stronger the light, the sharper this will be, and even a strong light will have blur at some point. And the more diffuse a light is, the less its shadow will be. Now you can see that a cast shadow is not a pit of darkness that no light can escape from, but that there's a lot of different types of light in here. And as we'll look closer when we add color, but you can see, even I think in this video, a lot of reflective light bouncing on to this bottom right here. So we have highlight, shadow core, reflective light, cast shadow, and within that cast shadow, we have a shifting edge and reflective light close to the object. That's light bouncing off this object in here. Here I have set up three groupings of objects with different proximities to the light source. The sphere and block are very close to the light source and receiving the most light. The cylinder and second box are further, and so while they are receiving light, while they do have areas of highlight, shadow core, reflective light, and cast shadow respectively, they're not as intense as the sphere and box that are close to the light source. As you notice, the objects that are closer to the light source, not only are their highlights a lighter value, but their shadow cores are darker as well, higher contrast. If you come over to this cylinder here, which is receiving that same type of light, it has a highlight, it has a shadow core, it has reflective light, it has a cast shadow, but its highlight, shadow core, and reflective light are all have less contrast. So while it has all of the same light patterns and same patterns of light, there are less contrast. This is because this object is further away from the light. And not only is its highlights brighter when they're closer to the light, but the shadows are darker and higher contrast. Okay, I would like to look at all of those elements and discuss how color, the role of color is with each of those. So the first thing I want to look at is reflective light. So reflective light, as I kind of indicated really clear, reflective light is how we can tell an object is with another object or is on an object or is in proximity to an object. And it is the light from another object, in this case the surface of this table, bouncing up. And as the light bounces, it not only lightens this, it also brings that color. So let's look at that happen. All right, let's look at this box. Here we have a box. The light is coming down, it's hitting the top, it's illuminating part of this side, and this side is in a deeper shadow. So this would be kind of a more of our shadow core. So we have kind of this highlight area, a transitional area, and our shadow core. And even in this shadow core area, there is a lot of reflective light. And let's look at how much color is bouncing up. So as we move that pink piece of paper underneath, you can see how this shadow, almost the whole thing becomes a little bit more purple. When we take it away, and now let's add it. All right, now look at the impact. Now this is a warm color, so it bounces light a little bit more. As the color bounces off, it tends to make it even slightly warmer. Let's look at this green. You can see how dramatic that it gets. It's not as dramatic as the pink. Okay. So this would be that reflective light. Now, this object is also bouncing light into this shadow. Okay, so I've taken our cube and I've wrapped it with construction paper, and I want you to kind of look at that reflective light here. Now, if you are looking at this and saying, okay, I'm not really seeing how pink that gets, I want you to take a moment and look at what happens as I lift it off. Okay, you can see that's really pretty dramatic. Let me bring it right back. You see how it goes from being kind of purplish pink reflected into the shadow to almost green. In both cases, this isn't just this being yellow, but a kind of cooler version of it. Now, when the object is near another object, it reflects back onto that object as well. I want to just show you what happens when we bring, look at how green that got with that blue bouncing back. Okay, that purple. And I'm going to remove it. Okay. Now, at first it's hard to see how much pink is bouncing on the blue. So it was very clear and easy to see the blue bouncing here. But this pink is also bouncing here. This blue is bouncing here. I think it's easiest to see if we slowly remove it. So I want you to look, now we're looking at the shadow to see how much purple or pink that is in that green shadow. Okay, I'm going to bring it back. The next thing I want to look at is more of a kind of a cylinder. So when we looked at our sphere, we saw highlight, shadow, core, reflective light. Let's look at that same reflective light on a cylinder, mostly because it's easier to wrap. So here we have a highlight, here we have our shadow core, here we have our reflective light, here we have our cast shadow, and you can see that cast shadow has lots of different reflective light in it. In just a quick moment, if I kind of put that underneath, you can almost instantly see this whole area turn pink. If you're having trouble seeing that, something like that, even that, see where it isn't? Now, in the shadow, the reflective light goes both ways. As we saw in the cubes, it was both bouncing up here, but is also bouncing down here. Let's wrap this. Okay, there you go. You can see a really dramatic orange down here on this surface. If you're having trouble seeing that, let's move it over, and you can see it starts in here. And here, because this is transparent, it's really glowing. So we have the shadow really changing color from the cool white bouncing into it, the orange bouncing into it, and some reflective light. Now, as I said, it's not just warm colors that bounce around, though we tend to see them a little easier. But we can also see how cool colors reflect in as well. And you want to notice how different it is. So we have this blue, the cool white reflecting, orange, and then the orange transparent. All right, so we've looked at a lot of different ways on how color is bouncing around in terms of reflective light and how that's affecting our cast shadows. For the next thing I want to go over is a little harder to see. So for this, I found choosing pretty neutral objects was a little easier. So I have two pieces of wood. They're cut from the same board, so they're the same color. And if you're seeing a little brightness here, it's because the end of the wood was painted orange, so ignore this side. So we have the light coming in. It's illuminating this side. This would be the highlight that we can see, kind of the diffused transition, more the shadow core, and the cast shadow. Now, the cast shadow and the shadow core are both shadows, and in this case, they're both on objects with the same local value and local hue. But they tend to be different colors. So the light in this shadow and the temperature color of the shadows are both different. And this is a subtle difference. And the easiest way to see this is to exaggerate the light. So if your light is warm, then your cast shadow will be cooler, whereas the shadow core will be still be just a darker version of this local value. local hue. Now, this light is a little on the warm side, but to really see this, I'm going to exaggerate it by putting a filter over my clamp light, a physical filter over my clamp light. I don't think the camera is capturing this perfectly, particularly when it comes to the color of this backdrop, but let me explain what we have right here. I have a clamp light with a yellow filter on it, so it's shooting really yellow light on this whole scene. And what I want you to notice is that while the value of this cast shadow and this shadow core are very similar, so they're the same value, and the local color of this wood and this wood are the same, including their local value, the temperature of this and this are very different. The shadow is much cooler, much purpler, much bluer than the shadow of the same value here. So what I want you to take away from this, although it's subtle, is that cast shadows, if the light is warm, tend to be cooler than the shadow cores on their object. Okay, let's recap. We've talked about the hierarchy of light, how as light leaves its source, the objects that are closer are illuminated more. This affects both their highlights and the cast shadows. They tend to have higher contrast the closer they are to the light. We also talked about how shadows become dimmer and dimmer and blurrier the further they get from the light source. We talked about how when we have reflective light, the color is bouncing around, both color bouncing back onto the object and onto the background as well. Another thing we looked at is the temperature difference between a shadow core and a cast shadow. That typically with warmer light, these cast shadows tend to be a little bit cooler.